Good morning, everyone. So today, we're going to talk about individualism versus collectivism. And I sort of got this topic from my recent trip to Germany, where culture's a little bit different, and I started wondering, what's kind of the cost-benefit of being an individual versus being part of the collective? So the Germans are very interesting people with a very interesting history, obviously. And on one hand, they're a lot more collectivists than Americans are, but still very individualistic in their reliance on themselves, their development of their skills, their desire to invest, and in the way their communities are constructed in terms of participating, keeping things clean, orderly, rule-based, is much more structured than we have here. And so that got me to thinking, I wonder which is better, individualism versus collectivism. And I was also reading a book called The Inevitable by Kevin Kelly, who has been an editor for Wired, among other things. And he was talking about a lot of the technologies in the world today and how it allows us to be more collective and contribute to things oftentimes without pay. So, which is better, right? Some might argue that individualism leads to things like greed and corruption and a lack of participation with our neighbors, while collectivism can oftentimes stifle dissent and lead to censorship or a lack of innovation. So I think we should weigh the merits of both and then try and figure out what the right balance looks like for a society we want to be a part of. So how do we optimize that? How do we consider which bits of each are best, and then how do we implement them, and what are the downsides to those? Now, of course, it's always going to be a little bit of both, right? Nothing exists in its theoretical sense, at least not in the real world. And it's also going to be situational, right? There are going to be times where having a more individualist perspective might be beneficial. For instance, in a crisis, when a decision needs to be made quickly, gaining complete consensus might not be the optimal route. And then we've talked about before that humanity exists almost as a superorganism, right? We're all individual bodies or cells, but we really all contribute to the collective nature of humanity and our collective progress. Whether we want to or not, we really are part of that whole superorganism. So as we think about that we exist both as individuals and as part of humanity, that's something for us to consider. And so when we're looking at different countries, I pulled a bunch of these different stats from the Hofstede, which is, this guy basically created an index for these different categories of how countries are in terms of power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. So I started with Germany. The thing I found about Germany that was interesting is, from my perspective, they're much more collective, right, coming from the American perspective. It's a scale out of 100, they rate 67 out of 100. I said, wow, that seems a lot more individualistic. So 100 is completely individualistic and 0 is completely collectivist. I thought that was a lot higher than I would have maybe scored them from my perspective, but of course I'm biased by the American sense of individuality. America, by comparison, has a score of 91 for individuality. I think that makes sense to most of us that we would be much higher in that regard. And so when I thought about it, seeing how it manifests sort of in German society, for instance, they have a law that says that you have to keep the front of your house clean. You have to sweep the leaves and the dirt off the front of your house to make sure that it's basically orderly. Now, that in America, I think we would consider that a drastic overreach of the government, but at the same time, I think as individuals, we realize, well, we do like having nice neighborhoods, nice houses, that there are downfalls to not keeping things clean, right? Housing value, if communities degrade over time, that does actually affect us both as a community and as individuals for our property prices. And then I pulled some other ones to see maybe what the extremes look like. So Japan, for instance, had a score of individualism as 46, and I think most of us know that Asian societies tend to be a little bit more collectivist. China's individualism score is 20, so it's one of the very lower ones. And what's interesting is when you pair that with the power distance statistic, and so that's our willingness to adhere to a structured or hierarchical power structure. So in Germany, it's 35, so they actually want to contribute much more to the discussion as opposed to simply taking orders, basically. Americans are actually 40, so slightly higher, so we're a little bit more willing to take centralized instruction, but still also very individualistic. Japan's is at 54 for power distance, so kind of in the middle. China's is 80, so their willingness to take centralized direction is much, much higher than ours would be. And then I tried to find one that was a little bit more moderate, in the middle. So Spain, they're 51 on individualism, so somewhere in the middle, and then 57 on power distance, so a little bit hierarchical, but also still participatory. The thing I found interesting is that all of the first four, so Germany, USA, Japan, and China, all rated a little bit higher for masculinity, which has more to do with competition than it does with being macho, I would say. Whereas Spain is one of the few that I found that was lower than 50 on masculinity, so more on what you would consider the consensus side and enjoying more of what you do as opposed to being competitive with what you do. So I offer all that up to give us a scope, to see kind of what the options are, and I think most of us have at least some idea of what each of those cultures are like, and what elements of those cultures do we consider favorable, and which elements of those cultures do we consider to be not favorable, right? So Spain, for instance, has more of the fiesta and siesta mindset, right? So you don't live to work, you work to live, and to participate and to be part of the community. Japan, for instance, is much more work-oriented and status-oriented, but is also collectivistic and contributes to the family. Germany, again, is somewhat of a balance between those, so very hardworking, but also very rules-based, very structured, more participatory than the US. And then, of course, the US is very individualistic, driven by the sense of self and the sense of accomplishment, but lacks some of those community ties and contributions to the community. So with all of that said, excuse me, I wanted to highlight some pieces of both individualism and collectivism I think are important for us to keep in mind. So with individualism, that's much more toward the nuclear family. You care about yourself and your very immediate family. We tend not to have the larger extended family construct, for instance, in Mediterranean cultures. Some of the things that the features or the downsides of individualism is selfishness, but also being decisive, greed, corruption. Though I don't think corruption is exclusive to individualism, it just depends, I think, on how it manifests. Some of the goods with individualism is innovation, right? We tend to be a little bit more okay with solitude, which oftentimes can lead to that innovative thought, that creativity. And I think one of the big features of why individualism leads to those behaviors is the ability to dissent, right? As the individual, we see ourselves as separate from the rest, as having our own opinion, our own value separate from the whole. And that allows us to disagree with what might be the popular opinion, which I think is why, one of the reasons, it's a theory, a guess I'd say, why a lot of innovation comes out of the West and out of the US in particular, because we're willing to dissent and say, no, I disagree, there's a better way. Because we don't have to save face for our family, for the hierarchy. And those are things that go deep within our psyche that then cause us to behave differently. On the other hand, we have collectivism. So extended family is one of those big features, which to me is a fantastic resource. One that I've found in my travels away from my extended family is not having family members around, grandparents, aunts and uncles for the kids, is a resource drain, right? Because taking care of kids is hard, and it takes a village, but oftentimes we uproot ourselves from the village and move away, and then we isolate ourselves by our family constructs. But collectivism also gives rise to shared resources. but also complacence. It tends to be more bureaucratic. It takes longer to gain consensus, to be decisive. And so that feature for individualism, which was dissent, for collectivism is consensus. Right? So we get along a little bit better. Maybe we figure out how to put our needs in the back seat so that we can work for the whole, a little bit more harmony. And as we start to progress in how society, and particularly how work is done, and we move towards this post-work, possibly, this idea of post-work where there aren't enough jobs for the people on the planet, right? As we automate things, what is it that people will do? One of the struggles I think we've seen, and a thought is with the recent shootings, those people I think existed in a very individualistic sphere, where they're very disconnected from understanding how they relate to the rest of humanity. And that's one way things could go, without purpose, without work, without something that occupies us that we need to survive, because realistically in the West it's very easy to survive even without work because of our access to plenty. Our psyche, our community starts to break down. But on the other hand, if we're moving past work, where if we're not working, we have time for leisure. Leisure is also where we get our creativity. One of the things, if you look at historically in the Renaissance period, the people who were the inventors or creators tended to be people with money. They came from aristocratic families. So they had leisure time, which was very unusual at that time. And they were the ones that came up with these ideas because they had time to ponder and ask, why does the apple fall from the tree? Why do the stars move in such a way? And so if we keep people connected with community and we give ourselves more time for leisure, that might be actually the way that we go. We drive human progress even farther when more people have that leisure time. One of the counter-arguments is that, well, when people have plenty of time when they're not working, they're not productive. And I think we found that to be demonstrably untrue. When people have time, it unleashes their creativity. And most of the things we have today are because people either had the time or created the time to invest in something that they were passionate about. Most people want to do something worthwhile. At least that's what I believe. And in that regard, I think it's better to unleash that talent than keep it locked into the factory mindset where everybody's got to be churning out widgets or reports or services every day for no particular reason. So going back to the Germany example, it's individualistic, but they also tend to be focused on the longer game. I've read a very interesting book recently called Accidental Superpower, which talks about how geography has driven the power and the resources associated with any given country. And the thing that the author pointed out about Germany is because it's basically in between a whole bunch of other major powers throughout its history, they have realized as a people the need to invest and build the things that they didn't already have. That is, by the way, one of the measurement factors from Hofstede, which is long-term orientation. So Germany scores very high with an 83 on long-term orientation. America, by comparison, scores a 26. We tend not to be focused on the long term, more towards the instant gratification. Japan is at an 88, China's at an 87, and Spain's at a 48. So you see how some of the other countries have much more longer-term viewpoints. And so I think Germany offers a good example. Not everything about it is good, but being individualistic. So we have the ability to dissent, to be creative, to take charge, but also be a little bit more collective, focused on the long term and realizing that the community is part of that long-term solution, I think offers us a model or a template to work from as we think about what it is we might like to build for ourselves in the future. And they also focus a lot on personal responsibility, not just for yourself, though that is a big thing. If your car breaks down in Germany, for instance, you get a ticket because it's your responsibility to maintain your car appropriately. You're also responsible for having an emergency kit in the back of your car. So a lot more of that responsibility is mandated, but it's also built in culturally to where you're responsible for taking care of yourself, but that you're also responsible for contributing to the community, even in your own personal space, the sweeping of your front steps, for instance. And so what things demonstrate a little bit of this balance between individualism and collectivism? I would say open source projects are actually a very good example. So Wikipedia, for one, right? So Wikipedia is an open source, right? It's collectivist in how it works, but individuals are the ones that contribute to it. There's no mandate that anyone contributes to Wikipedia. It is simply there. Now, it's not completely open, where anybody can do anything, right? They've iterated how they manage the system so that there are some bits of oversight. There's a little bit more hierarchy in how the edits are made and how they're revised. But it's open source, and everybody contributed to it because they see the good for the rest of their community. Every web server today, or most of them, run on Apache, which is another open source platform. Very interesting to think that almost the entirety of our internet as we see it runs on something that's free as opposed to commercial. Reddit is another thing, right? So the community generates content and then upvotes that content. So it's a self-moderating system that people simply contribute to. Now, these are all technological solutions, but I think that actually indicates something interesting, that maybe up until this point, our ideas about collectivism were constrained to the theoretical and the ideological. So when people hear the word socialism, they think Soviet Russia, right? Which isn't exactly what socialism means, but that's the perception that we have related to it. So that was all very centrally managed, also very hierarchical, even though it was supposed to be collective in nature. That wasn't how it was implemented, right? So maybe today we actually have the technological tools to balance the rights of the individual with the need for collective action. And maybe it's these open source things, these technological things that are demonstrating how that could be done in a meaningful way. So going back to humanity as a superorganism, right? So Isaac Asimov wrote the Foundation series, and the point of that series was to demonstrate what it could look like. It was 25,000 years into the future, or something like that. That humans are both completely connected, but still able to separate, to get a little bit of solitude, to think on their own, to be part of or to look objectively at the rest of the community and say, I think there should be something a little bit different. I'd really recommend that series, by the way, for any of you who have not yet read it. I think it's important for us to realize that we are part of the whole, that we should be part of the whole. We are social creatures, and that we have to cultivate that community, but while still having the ability to withdraw and to dissent and to say, no, I don't think that's right. It's almost like our connection to the internet today. We are actually becoming more collective, even though we're at the same time sometimes more individualistic, right? We might exist in our echo chambers, but we also connect to and communicate with more people than we ever have before. Now, if that connection and communication is meaningful, I think depends on how that's used. But moving in that direction where we participate more and more with the global community, I think is almost an inevitable trend. So I think it's very important for us to then conceptualize what the ideal looks like. What kind of community do we want it to be, as opposed to simply letting it become what it will? To me, being engaged and decisive in our own way and creating the future we want is much more beneficial than simply waiting and saying, well, that's not what I wanted. So the question is, that I'll leave you with today, how do we shape our worlds to take advantage of both the collective and the individualistic? Thank you all for coming. I look forward to the discussion afterward. And I hope this gives you something to think about as you go forward to create your world for the better.